The rain had started days ago, gentle at first, then relentless. By the third day, the river that wound through the valley had swollen, creeping closer to the fields and homes of Willow Creek. Most people stayed inside, watching the water rise with growing fear. But on the edge of the village, Farmer Abdul was already pulling on his boots, his heart heavy with worry. Not just for his crops, but for the lives that depended on him. Abdul's farm was a patchwork of green fields, a red barn, and a weathered house. He lived alone, but his days were never lonely. Over the years, he had taken in stray animals, dogs with matted fur, cats with wary eyes, even a goat with a limp. They were his family, and he cared for them as tenderly as any parent. On the fourth night, the rain became a roar. The river burst its banks, sending muddy water rushing across the land. Abdul woke to the sound of frantic barking and the bleating of frightened animals. He grabbed his lantern and hurried outside, the water already ankle-deep in the yard. He found his animals huddled together in the barn, eyes wide with fear. "It's all right, my friends," he soothed, stroking their heads. "We'll get through this together." He quickly moved them to the loft, where the floor was higher and dry. But as he worked, he heard another sound, a desperate yowl, faint but unmistakable, coming from beyond the fence. Abdul's heart clenched. He knew there were strays in the village, animals with no one to care for them. He couldn't leave them to drown. Without a second thought, he pulled on his raincoat, grabbed a rope, and waded into the storm. The village was eerily quiet. The only sounds the rush of water and the distant cries of animals. Abdul called out, his voice lost in the wind. He searched behind sheds, under porches, and in the shadows of abandoned buildings. One by one, he found them. A shivering puppy trapped on a porch, a cat clinging to a tree, a pair of rabbits huddled in a cardboard box. He coaxed them gently, wrapping them in his coat and carrying them back to the safety of his barn. Each trip grew harder as the water rose, but Abdul refused to give up. He fashioned a makeshift raft from old barrels and planks, tying it together with rope. With every journey, he risked his own safety, but the thought of leaving any creature behind was unbearable. By dawn, the barn was filled with animals, his own and the strays he had rescued. The loft was crowded, but warm and dry. Abdul moved among them, offering food, water, and gentle words. The animals, sensing his kindness, pressed close, finding comfort in his presence. Outside, the floodwaters raged, swallowing fields and roads. News spread quickly through the village of Abdul's bravery. Neighbors, inspired by his selflessness, began to help. Some brought extra blankets and food. Others helped build barriers to keep the water at bay. For the first time in years, the village came together, united by a common purpose. As the days passed, the rain finally eased. The water receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris. But in Abdul's barn, there was hope. The animals he had saved, once lost and alone, now had a place to call home. One morning, as Abdul tended to his new friends, a little girl appeared at the barn door. She held a kitten in her arms, its fur still damp from the flood. "Can you help her?" she asked, her eyes wide with worry. Abdul smiled and knelt beside her. "Of course," he said gently. "There's always room for one more." Word of Abdul's kindness spread beyond Willow Creek. People from neighboring towns brought supplies and offered to adopt the animals he had rescued. The barn, once a refuge in the storm, became a symbol of hope and compassion. Abdul never saw himself as a hero. He simply did what he believed was right, caring for those who could not care for themselves. But to the animals he saved, and to the people who watched his courage, he was a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness can light the way. Years later, when the river ran calm and the fields were green again, children would visit Abdul's farm to hear the story of the Great Flood. They would sit in the barn, surrounded by animals, and listen as Abdul told them how, on the stormiest nights, a single act of compassion could change the world. And every time the rain began to fall, the people of Willow Creek remembered the farmer who braved the flood, not just to save his own, but to rescue every lost and frightened soul he could find. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember. True courage is found in kindness, and even the smallest act can make a world of difference.